It started with a tray. Not a weapon. Not a fight. Just a tray. Inmate Robert Jenkins had been inside the segregation unit of the Green River Correctional Facility in Kentucky for 8 months. He was serving time for assaulting another prisoner. But on this particular morning, what broke him wasn't violence, it was what they served him for breakfast. The guard slid a brown, rectangular lump through the slot in his door. No plate, no fork, no spoon. Just a grayish block wrapped in wax paper. Robert stared at it. It looked like a brick made from bread, beans, and carrots all mashed together. The smell was sour, part stale dough, part wet vegetables. "This what you call food," he muttered, picking it up with 2 fingers. It was cold. Heavy. Dense. From the other side of the tier, another inmate shouted, "Welcome to the loaf, bro," followed by laughter. Robert didn't laugh. He broke off a piece and chewed. It was hard to swallow, dry like sawdust. He gagged on the second bite and threw the rest against the wall. The brown chunk slid down slowly, leaving an oily stain behind. He didn't know it yet, but this strange punishment loaf, would push him into one of the most controversial prison battles in America. The food loaf, sometimes called disciplinary loaf, has been used in U.S. prisons for decades. It's not designed to poison or injure inmates. It's designed to punish. Guards and wardens call it nutritionally complete. Inmates call it inedible. The loaf is usually made from a mixture of bread, vegetables, beans, and powdered milk, sometimes mushed with fruit or meat, all blended together, baked until it hardens, and served 3 times a day. No seasonings, no variety, and no choice. For Robert, it wasn't just the taste. It was what it meant. He had been put on loaf punishment for throwing his food tray at a guard the week before. According to the prison's rules, that meant 7 days on the loaf. But 7 days turned into 10. Then 12. And when he started complaining, it turned into 15. Every morning, he heard the same sound, the metal clank of the food slot opening, the dull thud of the loaf landing on the tray. At first, he refused to eat it. But by day 3, the hunger gnawed through his anger. He ate. He gagged. He ate again. By the end of the first week, his stomach hurt. He felt dizzy, weak. He hadn't seen the sun in 2 weeks. His water bottle tasted metallic. And then, he started seeing things. He claimed later that the walls moved. That the ceiling breathed. Whether it was real or hunger-induced hallucination, only Robert knew. But his desperation was real. On the 12th day, he snapped. He pressed his face to the narrow slot on his door and shouted, "You can't do this to me. I got rights." From the hall came a voice, "You had rights. You lost them when you threw that tray." Then silence. That night, Robert tried to hide his loaf under the bed. He wanted to save it, maybe trade it if he ever got out of the hole. But the smell filled the cell, sour and sweet at the same time. He woke up coughing. Rats were scratching near the vent. By morning, the smell was unbearable. He pressed the call button on the wall until an officer came. When the door opened for a second, the guard wrinkled his nose. "What's that smell?" "Your food," Robert said. The guard didn't reply. He just shut the door and walked away. Later that week, a nurse visited the segregation block. She took one look at Robert, his sunken cheeks, cracked lips, the tremor in his hands, and wrote down something in her chart. Within hours, the warden got a call. That call would trigger an internal investigation that exposed something far bigger than one inmate's suffering. Inside Green River, Robert's complaints were not new. But now there was evidence, medical logs, disciplinary forms, and other inmates backing his story. Some claimed they'd been on the loaf for months. One said he'd lost 20 pounds. Another said his teeth loosened. When news leaked to a local journalist, the headline hit the evening news. Inmates claim Kentucky prison using loaf as torture. That was the moment the story went national. Prison officials defended themselves, saying the loaf was nutritionally balanced and approved by dietitians. They insisted it was legal, used only for disciplinary purposes. But behind the steel doors, inmates whispered about something darker, that the loaf wasn't just food. It was control. Robert made a decision that would change everything. He asked to speak to a lawyer. The next day, he began writing letters, one to the ACLU, another to a civil rights attorney in Louisville. Each one started the same way. "I'm writing from segregation. They are feeding us punishment food. And I think it's breaking people." Weeks later, one of those letters made it into the hands of an investigative journalist. And soon, everyone from prison watchdogs to state lawmakers wanted to know one thing. What exactly is inside that loaf, and why are inmates still eating it in 21st century America? By the time the news of the loaf broke in Kentucky, the story had already started to spread. Within weeks, reporters in Texas, Illinois, and New York began digging through old disciplinary records, and what they found shocked even veteran prison investigators. Food loaf, they learned, wasn't new. It had been around for decades, quietly baked into the policies of prisons across America. It wasn't listed under punishment in many manuals. Instead, it was disguised under clinical phrases like nutritional loaf or restricted diet meal. But behind those official words were hundreds of pages of complaints, letters from inmates describing dizziness, nausea, and starvation. In Texas, one case stood out. Inmate David Harper, serving time at the ACLU unit near Huntsville, filed a handwritten grievance claiming he had been on the loaf for 21 consecutive days after refusing to return a meal tray. "I was so hungry I started eating toothpaste," he wrote. His handwriting slanted and faint, almost unreadable. "My stomach hurt so bad I couldn't sleep. I begged for regular food. They said I had to learn my lesson." When lawyers from a local legal aid group visited the prison to verify Harper's story, they discovered something bigger. The loaf punishment wasn't limited to the most violent inmates. It was being used for almost anything: refusing to stand for head count, talking back to guards, even having too many sheets of paper in a cell. Across the country, in New York's Rikers Island, another inmate told a similar story. He said, "You don't get the loaf because you're dangerous. You get it because you're loud." The ingredients were nearly the same everywhere: bread, vegetables, beans, and powdered milk, mixed, baked, and cooled into dense bricks. Some states added powdered eggs or fruit. Others left them plain. But what truly disturbed investigators was how long it was used and who approved it. In some prisons, it was signed off by a warden. In others, by a dietitian. One state even had it listed as a behavior modification tool. The words made it sound clinical, even humane. But in reality, it was a slow, grinding form of punishment that left inmates mentally and physically drained. When the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, caught wind of the reports, they began collecting affidavits from prisoners in at least 5 states. By early 2011, they had over 200 accounts describing the same thing: severe weight loss, illness, and humiliation. One inmate from Florida wrote, "I lost 30 pounds in a month. I'd rather starve than eat that thing again." Another said, "You start to feel like an animal, like they're training you with hunger." The ACLU filed a motion against the Florida Department of Corrections, calling the loaf punishment cruel and unusual. That phrase, drawn straight from the Eighth Amendment, would become the legal spark that pushed this prison food controversy into the national spotlight. When the first hearing began, the courtroom atmosphere was tense. The state's lawyers argued that the loaf was safe, tested, and nutritionally complete. They even brought a sample in as evidence, sealed in plastic, labeled Restricted Loaf, Florida DOC. One of the defense attorneys, a gray-haired man in glasses, tapped the package on the table and said, "This loaf meets every nutritional standard required by the state. It's not meant to taste good, it's meant to maintain discipline." The judge frowned, glanced at the loaf, and asked a simple question. "Would you eat it for 7 days straight?" The room went silent. The question echoed through the courtroom and across America. Over the following months, reporters began visiting prisons where the loaf was still in use. Some correctional officers defended it fiercely. They said it prevented riots and reduced food-throwing incidents. "It's not about torture," one officer said during an interview. "It's about control. You have to understand, in here, food is currency. You take it away, you take away their power." But others, including former wardens, disagreed. A retired Florida warden admitted, "The loaf doesn't reform anyone. It breaks them. And once you break a man, you can't fix him again." By 2014, several states had already banned the practice. Maine, Pennsylvania, and California quietly phased it out after lawsuits. But others, including Texas and Georgia, continued to use it, sometimes under different names, like special management diet. When journalists asked why, a Texas DOC spokesperson replied, "It's not punishment. It's policy." But behind that calm official tone, something else was brewing. The investigation revealed that in some prisons, guards used the loaf not just as discipline, but as retaliation. Inmates who filed complaints, spoke to the media, or testified against guards were sometimes placed on the loaf for minor violations. One of those inmates was Robert Jenkins, the same man who started this story. By now, his case had reached federal court. The judge ordered a medical evaluation. Robert weighed 30 pounds less than when he entered segregation. His testimony became the emotional centerpiece of the ACLU's argument. He told the court, "I wasn't trying to fight the system. I just wanted real food. Something warm. Something human." When the hearing adjourned, one journalist asked him if he thought the loaf would ever be banned nationwide. Robert hesitated, then said quietly, "They'll change it when they taste it." That quote went viral. It appeared in newspapers, online articles, and even on TV talk shows. Viewers were stunned that such a punishment still existed in modern America. Soon after, several lawmakers proposed bills calling for a review of all food-based disciplinary measures in federal and state prisons. But the system moved slowly, and resistance was strong. The Department of Corrections in several states argued that banning the loaf would weaken security. Prison unions protested, saying, "If you take away every tool we have, you put our officers at risk." Slow aerial shot of multiple state prisons across the U.S., connected by red lines glowing across a map. It was no longer just about food. It had become a battle between discipline and dignity, between authority and human rights. And while some states agreed to suspend the loaf pending review, others quietly doubled down, rewriting their policies in vague language to keep it alive. But the tipping point came when a whistleblower, a prison cook in Illinois, leaked internal documents showing that expired ingredients, including spoiled bread and moldy vegetables, were being used in loaf production. When reporters confronted the prison director, he said, "It's cooked at 350 degrees. Nothing survives that." The public outrage that followed reignited the national conversation. The ACLU announced new lawsuits in multiple states, and human rights organizations began demanding full abolition of food punishment in American prisons. Yet even as the lawsuits multiplied, inside the walls of several prisons, from Texas to Georgia, inmates still received the same tray, the same brown block, 3 times a day. And for many of them, the only question left was simple and chilling. If food is supposed to keep you alive, why does this one feel like it's meant to break you? By the time the lawsuits reached federal court, dozens of states had already issued public statements saying the loaf punishment had been banned. But that wasn't the whole story. Behind closed doors, many of those same states quietly replaced the term disciplinary loaf with new ones, phrases like restricted meal, alternative nutrition diet, or behavioral modification meal. Different names. Same food. On paper, the loaf was gone. In reality, it had simply gone underground. In 2016, an internal memo leaked from the Illinois Department of Corrections exposed how the policy had been quietly rewritten to keep the practice alive. The memo stated, "To maintain order and safety within segregation units, wardens are authorized to implement restricted meal programs consistent with prior nutritional standards." Those prior standards were identical to the old loaf recipe, the same mixture of bread, beans, powdered milk, and vegetables. Only now, the punishment had a new name and fewer paper trails. When journalists confronted the DOC spokesperson, she denied the connection. "There is no such thing as the loaf in Illinois anymore," she said. But when asked what the restricted meal looked like, she hesitated. "It's similar," she admitted. "Just nutritionally balanced." Across the country, the same pattern emerged. In Texas, the punishment was rebranded as a special management diet. In Georgia, it was called a control meal. In Arizona, officials referred to it as nutrient bar compliance. It all sounded bureaucratic and harmless, until reporters dug deeper. In Georgia, one inmate filed a grievance describing how the so-called control meal was the same cold brown block they used to call the loaf. He claimed he was fed it for 2 weeks straight after a verbal argument with a correctional officer. When investigators obtained a sample from a whistleblower, a nutritionist analyzed it in a lab. The result was shocking. Despite claims that it met daily nutritional standards, the sample contained less than half the necessary protein and calorie count for an adult male. One nutritionist told reporters, "If you fed this to an animal for 2 weeks, you'd see signs of muscle loss. For humans, it's worse: fatigue, dizziness, depression." The reports reignited outrage. But instead of ending the practice, some prisons doubled down, tightening their secrecy even more. In Florida, where the ACLU had previously won a partial victory banning the loaf in general population, documents later revealed it was still being used in high-risk behavior units. The justification? Inmate safety and institutional order. When one guard was anonymously interviewed, he said, "You can call it whatever you want. It's the same brick. We just don't write loaf anymore." But while the states hid the loaf under new names, something else began to change: the conversation. Activists and former prisoners started speaking publicly about the psychological toll the loaf left behind. They described it as more than hunger. They called it erasure. "It's not just food punishment," one former inmate said. "It's how they make you disappear. You stop thinking about days, you start thinking about bites." In 2018, the Human Rights Defense Center published a groundbreaking report titled "Starved into Silence." It documented how, despite public claims of reform, 11 states still allowed food-based discipline in some form. The report included leaked menus, testimonies, and nutritional analyses proving that the loaf had survived every ban, hidden behind policy language that sounded humane. When the story hit national television, the public reaction was immediate. Viewers flooded social media with outrage. How is this still happening? Why isn't anyone stopping it? Would you feed that to your dog? Under mounting pressure, some states, like New York and Oregon, issued official bans, outlawing any food used for discipline. But others, like Texas, Florida, and Arizona, refused to follow. Their defense was always the same: it's not punishment, it's policy. And so the loaf lived on, renamed, disguised, but not forgotten. One warden, speaking off record, explained why the loaf never really died. He said, "Look, prisons run on fear and order. You take away one, you lose the other. The loaf? It's not about nutrition. It's about control. It reminds inmates who's in charge." That quote later appeared in a documentary that aired nationwide. The footage showed slow, haunting shots of cell doors closing, trays sliding through narrow slots, and untouched loaves sitting cold on the floor. But the final twist came not from journalists, but from inside the system itself. In 2021, a correctional officer from a Texas Supermax prison anonymously leaked video footage showing inmates being served the so-called special management diet. The video went viral. It showed guards in gloves handing out identical brown bricks to inmates in solitary confinement. The footage was time-stamped, and matched internal logs labeled "nutritionally controlled meal program." Public backlash forced the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to respond. In a press statement, they wrote, "The food served meets all nutritional requirements as certified by licensed dietitians. It is not intended as punishment." But a week later, an internal whistleblower provided photos from the prison kitchen. One showed a tub of mixed leftover vegetables and breadcrumbs labeled "Loaf Prep Batch Number 7. That photo ended up on the front page of multiple national news outlets. Suddenly, every department that had renamed or disguised the loaf was under investigation again. As the pressure mounted, several states announced immediate suspensions of all restricted meal programs pending review. In an ironic twist, one of the people called to testify at a federal hearing on food-based punishment was none other than Robert Jenkins, the inmate whose original complaint had started the movement years earlier. Robert appeared via video link from a halfway house. His voice was calm, steady, but tired. He told the committee, "They didn't just feed us the loaf. They fed us the message that we didn't matter. Changing the name doesn't change what it does." The room fell silent. When the hearing ended, one senator leaned toward a reporter and whispered, "After all these years, they still serve it. Just colder." Today, as of 2025, the so-called food loaf has been officially banned in 19 states. But in others, it continues under alternate names: nutrition loaf, restricted meal, behavioral diet. The recipes vary. The excuses don't. And though many prisons claim reform, leaked photos and letters still tell another story, of dry, brick-shaped meals slid through metal slots in cells far from public view. For inmates still inside, the fight isn't just about the loaf anymore. It's about dignity. About whether punishment should strip a person of their humanity, one meal at a time. As one former prisoner wrote in his final letter before release, "I survived the loaf. But I'll never forget the taste of what it meant."